The bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese caused a ripple of war hysteria that led many to believe Japanese Americans would spy for their native country in order to aid them during World War II. Shortly after this event, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1941, and over 100,000 Japanese Americans were forced into concentration camps. One man decided to defy the order, and his defiance led to a Supreme Court case that questioned the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066 and addressed the problem of racial discrimination within the government. Examining these issues that were behind the Fred Korematsu case presented a conflict between the government and Japanese Americans. Fred Toyosaburo Korematsu was born in Oakland, California on January 30th, 1919. Although his parents were immigrants, he grew up like any other American child, attending public school and joining team sports. Shortly after World War II had started, Korematsu, who was around 20 years old at the time, applied to join the U.S. National Guard and Coast Guard, but was rejected because he was Japanese. He still wanted to help war efforts and trained to become a welder. He got a job on the Oakland Harbor and helped to repair warships. One day, he arrived at work to find a notice. He had been fired from his job due to his Japanese ancestry. Prejudice against Japanese Americans were raw, especially with the recent attack on Pearl Harbor. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt put Executive Order 9066 into motion. Japanese Americans were given the notice to report to a certain location where they would be shipped off to camps. They could only bring what they could carry. Many families had to sell their shops, houses, and furniture, along with other personal belongings. Korematsu didn't understand why he was going to be imprisoned, as he had done nothing wrong. He was an American citizen, and that meant that he had the rights to a fair trial if he was being accused of breaking the law. The 14th Amendment for citizenship states, quote, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." End quote. Yet, under Executive Order 9066, American citizens were deprived of their rights. Korematsu and other Japanese Americans were considered a military threat and therefore had to be relocated. Korematsu did not agree that Japanese Americans had to be imprisoned just because they looked like the enemy, so he decided to defy Executive Order 9066. Korematsu went under the alias Clyde Sarah and pretended to be of Spanish and Hawaiian descent. He also underwent minor plastic surgery, which altered his eyes to look less Japanese. He then tried to start a new life on his own. On May 30th, 1942, Korematsu was walking down a street in San Leandro, California, when policemen stopped him. He was detained until more policemen arrived, and he was eventually arrested.
Were you afraid of being arrested?
No, I wasn't, because I didn't feel that I did anything wrong. And if anybody did it wrong, it was the law, because I figured it was unconstitutional what they were doing.
Korematsu spent many long days in the San Francisco County Jail, and one day got a visitor. That visitor was Ernest Basig, a lawyer that worked for the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU was, and still is, an organization that works in their communities to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties that the Constitution and the laws of the United States guarantee everyone in this country. Basig was the one to ask Korematsu if he wanted to be the test case to challenge the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066, and Korematsu said yes. This started the endless series of appealing to court that pushed Korematsu's case all the way to Supreme Court, and woven into history. Although Ernest Basig paid Korematsu's $2,500 bail, Korematsu was still sent to an incarceration camp located in Topaz, Utah. There, Korematsu was discriminated against by his fellow Japanese Americans because many thought that fighting the court for his freedom would just cause more distrust between the U.S. and Japanese Americans. Despite all the talk that he shouldn't go through with his case, Korematsu was determined to fight for his civil liberties. In March 1944, the Supreme Court finally agreed to hear Korematsu's case, and later that year, in December, Korematsu received a letter from Basig. They lost. The decision was 6-3, the 6 being the majority that ruled that it was legal to remove Japanese Americans from their homes. Quote, military authorities feared an invasion of our west coast and felt constrained to take proper security measures because they decided that the military urgency of the situation demanded that all citizens of Japanese ancestry be segregated from the west coast temporarily. End quote. This was an excerpt from the majority opinion written by Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black. The ruling, however, was not unanimous. The 3 judges that dissented from the majority vote were Frank Murphy, Owen Roberts, and Robert Jackson. In Owen Roberts' dissent, he explains the following. Quote, on the contrary, it is the case of convicting a citizen as a punishment for not submitting to imprisonment in a concentration camp based on his ancestry and solely because of his ancestry, without evidence or inquiry concerning his loyalty and good disposition towards the United States. If this be a correct statement of the facts disclosed by this record, and facts of which we take judicial notice, I need hardly labor the conclusion that constitutional rights have been violated. After losing his case and the war being over, Fred Korematsu rebuilt his life after being released from the camps and married Catherine Pearson, with whom he had 2 children, Karen and Ken Korematsu. Fred became very active in his community and started attending church. One morning in January of 1982, Fred got a phone call from Peter Irons, an American political activist and civil rights attorney. Irons had found new evidence that would help overturn Fred's conviction. They were documents from the National Archives, stating that there had been no evidence of Japanese Americans spying for Japan or even being a threat at all.
I found a memo, and it was written by a government Justice Department lawyer named Edward Ennis. And it was written to the Solicitor General of the United States, Charles Fahey, at that time. I knew their names already from WRA records that I'd looked at earlier that Aiko and I had gone through from the WRA. And in that memo, which was a memo to the Solicitor General who was preparing to argue the Korematsu case before the Supreme Court in 1944, Ennis said, we are in possession of information that shows that the War Department's report on the internment is a lie.
Fred agreed to work with Irons, and Irons assembled a team of lawyers that would work pro bono for Fred. Most of these lawyers were also Japanese American, Sansei, or 3rd generation. Many of their parents had also been imprisoned in the camps, and helping Fred win his case would make the government admit that they had done wrong to their parents by placing them in the incarceration camps. On November 10, 1983, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel overturned Korematsu's conviction in the federal court building in San Francisco, the same court where he had been convicted nearly 40 years prior. In 1998, the Civil Liberties Act was passed, and it granted people that had been incarcerated in the camps $20,000, along with the formal apology from President George Bush. A compromise had finally been achieved. Even after he won his court case, Fred Korematsu traveled all over to spread his message. That was, we should not let what happened to Japanese Americans happen to anyone else. He talked at many schools and colleges, sharing his story with others. And on January 15, 1998, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bill Clinton. He continued to be an activist throughout his community and died in May of 2005. January 30th is officially named Fred Korematsu Day, the first day to be named after an Asian American. This day is to remember his biggest accomplishment, winning the battle for civil liberty.